Hi, everyone. Obviously, I am not Shirin Neshat, but welcome. It's so nice to see you at this busy time of the academic year for those of you that are students, faculty, and staff here at Brown. And I think it's a busy time of the year for those of you who are members of our wider community as well. But I'm so happy to see you. I'm Wendy Lee, Associate Director at the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women here at Brown. And I'm also the Director of Undergraduate Studies for our Gender and Sexuality Studies program. So welcome to our annual Pembroke Publics Lecture, which this year is co-sponsored by the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown. In 2021, the Pembroke Center Director Leela Gandhi launched the Pembroke Center Publics Initiative and Lecture Series. This initiative and lecture series brings to Brown distinguished guests whose work in any sphere, from academics to art to activism and well beyond, contends with issues of gender and sexuality in a transformative manner. In spring 2022, American scholar, writer, and poet Alexis Pauline Gumbs delivered the inaugural Pembroke Publics Lecture. And last spring, Dorothy Roberts, acclaimed social justice advocate and scholar of race, gender, and the law, spoke about the urgent need to recognize, integrate, and act on all the key principles of reproductive justice. This year, we are honored and thrilled to welcome Shirin Neshat to deliver the 2023 to 2024 Pembroke Publics Lecture. Neshat, as many of you know, is an Iranian visual artist who has been described and praised as perhaps the most famous living Iranian artist in the world. Over the course of her 3 decades-long career, Neshat has experimented with the mediums of photography, video, and film. She imbues her work with highly poetic and politically charged images and narratives that question issues of power, religion, race, gender, and the relationship between the past and present, East and West, individual and collective, through the lens of her personal experience living in exile. Neshat's work has been exhibited throughout the world and at many international art exhibitions, including the 48th Venice Biennale, where she won the top prize in 1999. Her first feature film, Women Without Men, won the Silver Lion for Best Director at the 2010 Venice Film Festival. Neshat has held numerous solo exhibitions at museums internationally, including the Pinakothek der Moderne, Munich, the Modern Museum of Art of Fort Worth, the Broad in Los Angeles, Museo Correr in Venice, Italy, and the Hirshhorn Museum, Washington, D.C., as well as the Detroit Institute of Art. Viewers of Neshat's work frequently note that her art centers on contrasts. Reviewing her 2023 show, The Fury, on view at the Gladstone Gallery in New York, the Brooklyn Rail, for example, observed that the installation was a formal expression of dichotomy, an enduring motif in her work. What the reviewer goes on to admire about The Fury, which you'll see about 10 minutes of after my introduction, is not just the expression of dichotomy, masculine, feminine, torturer, victim, and so on, but also how Neshat evokes the significance in between the dichotomies. As an admirer of Neshat's work, I find this idea of the significance in between to be evocative and applicable to much of her work. Though she is a visual artist, her photographs, videos, and film manage to find all that we cannot see, imagine, experience, and understand about someone else. And it is there that Neshat is asking you to look, in the in-between. This interest in dichotomy and the significance in between dichotomy, and perhaps the overlap between seeing contrasts or dichotomies, might be a way to understand not only Neshat's work, but the connections she proposes between her life and her work as an artist. She has, for example, described art for her as the place where her most inner and outer worlds connect. To turn to another example of dichotomy, on the dichotomy of East and West, Neshat has said that in exile, she has learned to be a complete Westerner and yet also a complete Easterner. And in doing so, learned to navigate emotionally, politically, geographically, in what we might call the significance of in-between. But across dichotomies and across the changes Neshat's work has undergone during her 3 decades-long career, there has been a constant. Questions of women, especially the significance between women, art, and politics. She explores these questions in her most recent work, The Fury, which she will be sharing with us in a few moments. And with that, I am happy to turn the floor over to Shirin Neshat for her talk, Women and Art in Times of Political Crisis. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Wendy. Your introduction was so brilliant that I thought you gave it away, everything that I was about to say. I wanted to thank you, but also the other ladies, Donna and Diana, for inviting me. I love coming back to Brown. Women and art in time of political crisis, it's a pretty big one to handle, and I don't think I can do justice to that. I am a woman, I'm a woman artist, and my work deals with politics, often during the political crisis, and I hope, after this talk, you can see for yourself how the work addresses it. But before I even start speaking to you, recently I came across this lovely quote by Leonard Bernstein, which I really like and I wanted to share with you. He says, "Art never stopped a war. That was never its function. Art cannot change events, but it can change people. It can affect people so that they are changed, because people are changed by art, enriched, encouraged. They then act in a way that may affect the course of events by the way they vote, the way they behave, and the way they think." So that sums us up, where I feel where art can play a role, and we'll come back plenty to that. But I wanted to tell you, it's been a very challenge for artists like myself how to articulate your work retrospectively in a talk that somehow is not overwhelming, but is also not so repetitive for me. So I thought I'd prepare something super intimate and personal tonight. And so you can see my personal journey as a human being, as a woman, as an Iranian American, and my artistic journey and why and how I became an artist. For that, I'm going to take you back to my childhood, and maybe you can unmute it. This is something I've never done before. My childhood was spent in a small town in Iran. And all I know that as a young girl, I always grappled with a life that was divided to two worlds: the life inside of my house and the life outside of my house. The life inside of my house was this beautiful, modest home with a big garden, a family of 5 children, with loving parents who were secular Muslim, modern, and a father that was an intellectual, very westernized, believed in modernity. And the world outside, which was a city that was extremely religious, conservative, traditional, that even I remember as a young girl that I couldn't walk in certain areas without the hijab. And during the time of my upbringing was also the period where the path was the revolution coming up, the overthrow of the Shah and the Iranian Revolution. So there was a lot of underground political activism. So I remember as a young person being conflicted between my attraction to religion, political motivation that was so big among my generation in the community, yet a family that was so westernized and so obsessed with modernity, and particularly with America. Hollywood was our window to America. I remember my uncle owned 2 cinemas, the only cinemas in town. And these films that we saw became the picture of America, the image of utopia, perfection, democracy, where everything always looked happy and sunny. People looked beautiful, beautiful homes, beautiful cars. This was the utopian image we had about America. And ultimately, my father won, and he sent me abroad to America. I arrived about 1975. I was 17 years old. And soon after, that image of Hollywood, that image of America, disillusioned what I had imagined. And in the aftermath came this intense feeling of sadness, disillusionment, alienation, and a real urge to go back. My father insisted that I stay and endure and be educated. Meanwhile, in 1979, we had the Iranian Revolution, exactly what my community were working toward. The war with Iraq immediately followed, and then the deep antagonism between Iran and the US, where all the diplomatic relationships broke down. So the walls came down between me and my country for the next 11 years. And the coming years was a period of profound displacement. And I was very lucky because I embraced art as a way to really cope with my unresolved emotional, psychological, political, and cultural dilemmas as a human being, but really as a way to make sense of the world. And career was not a part of the equation. I had, in fact, after I graduated from school, I didn't even make art for 11 years. This is a background for you to understand some of the dualities that Wendy so beautifully touched on. This contradiction between East and West, Islamic fundamentalism, modernity, exile, adoptive home, modernity and westernization versus the Orient. Some of the ideas that appear, the themes, the characters, the subjects of my work are the very projection and reflection of all of these contradictions that I just explained to you that I experienced growing up. Now, I just, for the fun, show you some pictures of my family. My parents, when they got married, my father was a physician, my mother was a household. This was our garden, and the chubby one is me in our garden. And my brother, it was perfectly, it was like a Persian miniature painting in a way, in terms of symmetry. And again, the chubby me is on the left. And, you know, my father put me in school that was somehow westernized, so I dressed like that. This is me and my parents, some of the other siblings. And as you can see, this fascination with the look of the European look that even my mother, and me, when I was just before I left. These are the images of the Iranian Revolution that basically transformed everything for the Iranian people inside out. And this is me after the revolution. And this is me exactly when I arrived to the US. So my birth certificate changed from that to this. And this is me in America. Okay, enough. Now, outside of this personal journey, I wanted to explain some things that are very important, especially if you have some young students here, that it's very important for you to understand that I've never been a traditional artist. I'm not faithful to any medium. My education has never been central to my practice. I'm working on still photography, video, movies, I'm directing operas. And this nomadic behavior of my relationship to the medium could explain a little bit about my lifestyle in the way that I keep moving. Every time I seem to feel safe, I move to the next place. I like to have new beginnings, new experiments. I'm always on the edge. So embracing new languages have been a way for me to not only experiment, but feel young and fresh. Thematically and conceptually, while the work evolves, there's certain things you need to pay attention to. My work is always very personal. but not autobiographical, because much of the subjects are rooted from who I am and really framing some of my own existential to political issues. The subject of politics, history, religion, as I explained to you earlier, are the very essence of my upbringing, the country I come from. I think Iranian people can't find a distance from political reality, from religion in the way that it has defined our lives. Poetry, literature, whether it's through a song or through calligraphy over the pictures, or a novel that I turned into a movie called Woman Without Men, have been central to my work. And I think this is a part of the Iranian ethnicity, that literature, poetry, metaphoric language is the way that we express ourselves. This is the only way we can transcend censorship and have some kind of freedom of expression. Everything that it's subversive and you can read between the lines. So I have, whether it's in video or a movie or a photograph, everything is highly allegorical and poetic. The idea of the paradoxical and duality, as you can see in all of the work, as Wendy said, it's very evident in my work. I often work with magic realism, surrealism, dreams, visually, but thematically. It's about repression, yet strength. It's about spirituality and beauty, but violence and disturbing material. So it's always about things that are pulling apart, never a whole. My entry into the art world became Woman of Allah in 1995 or 93. Woman of Allah was really after my first return to Iran, after having been absent for good 11 years, and really trying to come to terms with a revolution that I had pretty much missed out of, that my generation, my colleagues, my friends had been responsible for. And I focused on the subject of martyrdom, the growing fanaticism that transformed the culture of Iran from the cosmopolitan society that I knew to the Islamic Republic of Iran. This obsession with life and death, this obsession with life really after death, how people were encouraged. In a way, martyrdom was an idea that was institutionalized by the government to encourage them, men and women, to join the war with Iraq. So in a very stylized and fictionalized way, I came up with a series of work that ultimately created this tension between religion, fanaticism, the sexuality, eroticism of the female body that was in full contradiction with violence. The text that was written by Iranian women poet that were hugely, had a conviction with Islamic fundamentalism. And the elements were the female body that's highly problematic and very sensual and often concealed by the veil, which, as you can see, that's another element. The gun, which is obviously an element of violence. And the text, which is the voice, the intellectual, emotional voice of the woman. At that time, I posed for the images myself, as I actually didn't have a career, I was just fooling around. And these images became hugely controversial. And it was shot in New York, but they were completely controversial because some people, including the Islamic Republic of Iran, found it offensive and they thought that was critical of them. There were people who were against the Islamic Revolution and the government that thought that I was actually embracing fanaticism of this government. And the Western critics thought that I was just sensationalizing violence. So it was after the Woman of Allah that I turned to video. With the video came the move out of the studio, moving to a place where I can have music, I can incorporate theater, choreography, the camera movements. And Turbulent was obviously about the situation in Iran where women are deprived from the experience of music. They're not allowed to sing. But here, opposite to the Woman of Allah, the poetry, the evocative nature of the video stopped the work from having that strong sense of judgment that previously I'd experienced from photography. That allowed certain amounts of ambiguity, experiential relationship to the video, where these two videos were in two opposite channels. You as the viewer sat in between, and you were listening to music by a man who was singing very traditional music, classic Persian music, and where the woman at the end responded with very guttural and a music that broke every rule of the traditional music. So although the work was highly political, it functioned in a very, very different level. So this came my obsession and fascination with video. And although the images were still very photographic, as you can see, every picture, every frame of the video became like a photograph. But they were beginning to tell the story. I began to move to work in landscape. If the photographs were highly posed and always against the blank wall, here you had choreography, you had landscape, you had theater. I had 100 men and women. I shot this piece in Morocco. And essentially with Rapture, it was 100 men and 100 women. The men were in this fortress in the city of Esovera, and the women were in nature. So it was this relationship, it was almost like a dance choreography of a group of women moving in nature while the men moved in space of a very typical masculine space. So for me, this new early work of video was an opening of a time where I felt that I can move away from still photography, that everything had to be expressed within one frozen image, that I could be a storyteller. But the stories were still very much rooted on image. There was absolutely no language. Choreography, music, landscape. And this became the third video that I did, The Fervor, which took this issue of the masculine and feminine into the next level. And it really became about the impossibility of man and woman to have any sexual temptation or connection within a culture that considers it a sin. Fervor was really, the trilogy for me was really talk about the subject of men and women. And if there was in the earlier part in Turbulent where you saw the woman rebelling by singing untraditional music, in Rapture they were able to go into the sea and take refuge, whether that was an idea of freedom or suicide, it wasn't very clear, but it was symbolic of women who were taking their destiny into their own hand. And here we had a man and woman that were in this event that looked both like a religious ceremony, but also a theater where they had this sexual tension, and this curtain became the boundary. And ultimately, the woman walked out. So this was visually and conceptually very much creating a trilogy about the masculine and the feminine. The Book of Kings for me was a return to still photography, but this time in 2009, it was a tribute to the 2009 Green Movement, which was the notion of patriotism, nationalism grew in the Iranian culture. This time was not for the religion, but for the notion of patriotism. And as you can see, I went once again to photograph people who, it's very simple body gestures, the hand on the heart, which is the Legion of Honor. I photographed people in New York, we had many people from the Arab Spring, and how this notion of love of culture, love of a nation, and patriotism often intersects with the notion of violence and atrocity and genocide. So we had representation of men as villains whose body was covered with a painting from Shahnameh from the 10th century, which was epic poems by Ferdowsi that talked about Iran during the Arab conquest, the scenes of battles and genocide and killings, while we had also the scenes, the images of the young patriots, young activists in Iran. So for me, this series basically embodied that notion of activism and patriotism that always brought violence, atrocity, and genocide close to love and compassion for a culture. And this is something that has been repeated in Iranian history. And if Ferdowsi talked about the ancient Persian history, now we're dealing with contemporary Iranian history. How Iranian people continue to be oppressed, and any notion of patriotism and nationalism is met with violence, repression by the regime. Some of my interest in literature and in music and in song is how to bring back ancient history of Iranian culture from both Islamic and Persian to my work. This is called Our House is on Fire. It's a commission that I did for the Rauschenberg Foundation, where I went to Egypt, following the Book of Kings, which is really about a tribute to Arab Spring, to the people of Iran during the 2009 and 2011 in Egypt, young people who were killed and the atrocity that followed with their notion of nationalism. I went to Egypt, to Tahrir Square, and I photographed the elderly people, the people who are considered the family of those young people who were now murdered or in prison. So for me, it was really a way to close this chapter of this whole period of Arab Spring and the Green Movement. And I just want to point out that if the Woman of Allah really talked about a point of Iranian history, of the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the Book of Kings meant to be a narrator about a different aspect of Iranian history, which was a population of young people who were modern, forward-thinking, were not religious, and all they wanted was democracy and liberation, and had nothing to do with religion. So some of the, so the images that I've show you, they have writings that I used this time, poetry by Egyptian writers as well as Iranian poets. This was the time that I learned that I can get out of the studio even for photography, that my photography began to be more like a reportage. I started to travel to different parts of the world, and I would do what actually a filmmaker would do. I would go scout people, I would choose the subject, I would find a theme that they could connect with, I would cast them. So if in Egypt I went and looked where people who were mainly from the poor area, people who had mainly lost their children, people who had really experienced the sorrow of the revolution. In Azerbaijan, I went and really focused on what is the meaning of home. Azerbaijan is a country that is next to my country. In fact, my mother is from Azerbaijan, but it's a country that is multi-ethnicity. People who are Armenian, Caucasian, from Russia, from Persia, and Turkish. They speak multiple languages, multiple different religions, but they all consider Azerbaijan their home. So for me, as someone who never had the experience of home, I thought it was interesting to focus on that subject, bring people and interview them, and ask them the question, what is the meaning of home for them? So I brought people of different ethnicities again, who are Azeris living in Baku. And the only thing that was different, highly stylized, was the body postures that I borrowed from El Greco, from the Christian paintings that I was very much inspired by. And eventually this work was shown in Musée Carrère, and that oddly enough, there was this image of Madonna, and that very much was accidental. But for me, it was the beginning of the time of coming out of studio photography, coming out of just photographing myself or my models, my friends, but going out to the world to photograph people, but also no longer just focusing on Iran or Islamic cultures, but thinking about the world as my canvas. And I realized that I had been by now and in exile for so many years that I no longer wanted to live with this point of view of a nostalgia, but I wanted to, as they say, you can take an Iranian out of Iran, but you can never take Iran out of an Iranian. So as long as I am behind the work is Iranian. So this was the beginning. This was in 2016. And it was the beginning of a turning point for me, that even though the work is still stylistically, visually carried on with the use of calligraphy and the compositions all became very similar, my method of working as a photography also changed. And even in the videos, I started to shoot in America. And with the video, there was a turning point, because by now I had studied cinema, and I could see that some of my videos began to become more cinematic. They have a protagonist. Some of the characters in the videos became an extension of myself, like a muse. This is Roja that I shot in 2015. It's an Iranian woman, and it was the first time that I made a video, but that there was actually, the story was not just about the group of people, but about a protagonist. But it also came with, Roja was the first time with my obsession about dreams, and the idea that much of our dreams are projections of our fears. How often when I dream about my mother. I dream, and in this particular video, was about my own dream, actually. And that very often, in the worst of the moments, I imagine my mother coming to my rescue. And finally, I understood that this mother figure wasn't just my mother, who she's still living, but it's a motherland. That this idea that the woman was standing in the threshold of America, but was dreaming about another world. And this is really an expression of the kind of duality, again, that we're talking about. The experience of life in exile, that you live in one place, but you dream in another. And that I found the idea of making work about dreams very powerful, because if my earlier work were so rooted in socio-political, religious realities, where people could not stop thinking about their own judgment and relationship to the subject matter of politics and religion, whether they're Jewish or Muslim or Western or Iranian, pro-Iranian regime, against the regime, all of that, working with dreams, because it had a footing in reality, but footing in things that didn't make sense. I have to apologize for a second. A few minutes ago, I had a little panic attack. I confess, and that I realized that I had a little panic attack, and this is good for me to admit to you. And this is who I am. I have made all this work, but I can still be very fragile and very vulnerable. So I collect myself. Dreams are where the madness, the sanity and insanity live together. And this is what I love, because what Wendy said, my art, I feel in many ways, is an expression of my madness, my inner world, everything that doesn't make sense. to the things that make sense, the world that I'm trying to make a sense of, the world that I'm trying to offer my point of view. And that I felt that my earlier work, it was so highly political that it wasn't giving me the mental space to have a distance and to communicate to my audience in a way that they could see it outside of that reductive, simplistic way of she's Iranian and she's talking about Islam and she's talking about repression. I never wanted to do that anymore. So this entry of sharing my work in a way that, yes, it is about Iran because I'm Iranian and it is about me, but it is about the world. And it is about existential political issues that we all face. Every one of you dream. And when you dream, you face your fears, things that you don't try to face when you're awake. And this obsession with dreams, for me, continued. The only thing is, now I found other women to play me. They're all very small, big eyes, Iranian, wearing black. And this was subconscious, by the way. I didn't mean to do that. If Roja was about this sense of displacement, this idea of exile, being in one place, dreaming of another place, Sarah was about fear of death, fear of when you are dead and suddenly you see the genocide, the residue of genocide, the fear of mortality. And a woman who, in the state of dream, does not know if she's dead or alive. Again, like Turbulent Rapture, Fervor, that was a trilogy. Sarah and Roja were part of a trilogy. This obsession with dreams continued. I made a video installation, photographic installation, and a feature-length film that all dealt with dreams. And in this case, I actually went to New Mexico. Sorry, now I'm feeling a little better. I'm only human. So I thought, for the first time, I make a project in America, something I'd never done before. I thought it's enough of making work in this idea of nostalgia, and that in this country, so many things are going wrong, and that finally, I've gained the license to give my critique about a culture that I've spent so many years in. But my point of view would always remain an Iranian immigrant point of view, not an American one. And I thought, what better than me collecting American people's dreams? And the idea that the artist turns into a dream catcher. I went to New Mexico, and I started with photography. I would just jump into the photographs, where this is the muse that played me. I went door to door to people's home. I traveled all over New Mexico, which is one of the poorest states in America, one of the most diverse states in America, where there's large Native Indian populations, African Americans, Hispanic, white. And I went to people's home, I went to the streets, I went to different places with 2 friends and my dog. And I asked if I could take their picture. And while taking their photographs, I asked if I could ask for their latest dream. And ultimately, I made this group of photographs that really became a portrait of America from my point of view. This is the image of America I had, the kind of diversity that I saw when I landed in this country. Land of dreams. Ultimately, this was where the dreamers came. This is where I came with my father's dream, where dreams would come true. And it's true that this, in some cases, is true. But this is also a country that is proving to be otherwise. So I created about 111 photographs that created this massive portrait, that all of this is considered one, that you were at once facing faces of Native Americans, blacks, Hispanic, men, women, functional, non-functional, young, old, and poor. In the video, in the same town, I went, she played myself. Then she went door to door, some of the same houses that I went. And this was a double channel projection, 10-minute video, where she introduced herself as an artist. So she, in a way, the video reenacted what I did. And she went knocking at the door, and I remember very clearly once I knocked at the door, and exactly this is what happened. A woman looked from a blind and saw this foreigner looking at her. And she opened the door and said, "Can I help you?" I said, "Hi, I'm an Iranian artist. I'm just doing a project, and I wonder if I could take your portrait and ask you for your dream." And she said, "That's very strange." And now my car was full of my colleagues who were all Iranian. The husband came, and he was an ex-military man. And he said, "Well, come on in." You know, they never met Iranians before. And he said, "Oh, I was in Iran." You know, they hadn't seen Iranians in their town. So they ended up allowing us, so photographing them, but also using their home. So then when we made the video, the actress went to some of the same homes that I had gone. I went to the Native American reservations and visited many of the natives. And she did, and she collected their dream. This is a double channel projection where you see her in America and her in this very strange colony that was tucked inside of this mountain. It's a very magic realist piece, very Kafkaesque. She's inside of this mountain. There is this peculiar laboratory, Iranian kind of hidden lab, that Iranian people are collecting Americans' dreams and portraits and analyzing them. So it was a very satirical, absurd project, but it really was very meaningful for me because I personally spent many weeks and days in New Mexico that led to photographic installation and video and a movie, which I will show you in a second. For me, New Mexico was also very nostalgic of Iran, the desert landscape, and how, in many ways, that was extremely nostalgic for me. So I explained about this. Now, the Fury. The Fury is about sexual assault. I didn't show you the whole piece because it's a little bit too long. For me, I've been, as you can see from much of my photographs, I have been obsessing about the female body in relation to religion, in relation to political ideology, how women have been systematically used, their body, as a way to embody the men's ideology. In the Iranian government, with the revolution, even during the Shah's father period, every time we have a new regime, they dictate their rhetorics and their ideology on the woman, whether they're forced to unveil or veil. So my work had paid a lot of attention to that, but I'd never dealt with the female body in relation to sexuality, sexual exploitation. With the Fury, I thought it was important to pay attention to incredible atrocities and sexual exploitation of the Iranian government, not only Iranian government, but at large in the world during the incarceration, especially during war. Whether it's the war between Russia and Ukraine, or whether it's the Israeli hostages, or the Palestinian, or in all over the world. The way that the women are the first to pay the price during war. And rape and sexual exploitation is systematically done. So I was following the trial of this very well-known prosecutor that is responsible for the massacre of over 3,000 political prisoners in Iran in the 1980s, from 15 years old to 20s. I listened to the trials over and over again and the testimonies of the parents. And I became obsessed with making, and they talked often about women who have been sexually exploited. Often they go mad, and often they commit suicide. How they never recover from the trauma. So I made this very stylized video that talks about a woman who's, although, and it's obviously highly fictionalized, that although is in the US, it's so traumatized and still lives in the past. And obviously, we shot it in New York, we shot it in my neighborhood in Bushwick. I want to explain that the scene at the end was, for me, really important because the pain and the sorrow and the suffering and trauma of others during oppressive and violent times like we're experiencing these days becomes very contagious. I feel the sense of identification with other people's pain. It's very important, as we're feeling today, these days, very strongly. And often, as I walk around in Bushwick, Brooklyn, where I'm a total outcast among Hispanic, African American, largely impoverished, poor community, I feel strongly connected to this community, even though we don't speak the same language, we're not from the same religion, we come from totally different backgrounds. But there is a strong feeling that if something happened to me, they will come to my rescue. And I feel this way at time of war, at time of political crisis, that when we see other people being traumatized and suffering, there's something awakens inside of us that is really beautiful, the sense of compassion, empathy. And that is the most hopeful thing that I think it's happening these days, the identification with other people's pain. So I created the last scene in The Fury, that when the woman is seen on the street, bruised and tortured, other people in a very stylized way through dance participate and support her, and there's a scene of protest. Now, my final stage is I've made 3 feature-length films. Woman Without Men was a magic realist novel by Sharnush Parsipour, a beloved Iranian woman who spent many years in prison. And basically, this is a story of 5 women who escaped their very complicated and troubled lives and took refuge in a garden, and the garden being very symbolic of a place of freedom and independence. And meanwhile, in the city of Tehran, there was a coup in 1953 when we had the CIA organized coup d'etat, and that they overthrew the democratically elected prime minister and brought back the Shah. So the story has, in one hand, the footing on exploring this woman's existential and emotional and political and sociological issues, but at the same time pursuing the country of Iran as it too was looking for an idea and freedom. It was the first time that I made a feature film that was in this epic scale. We shot in Morocco. It took 6 years to take this book and turn it into a screenplay. And it won the Venice Film Festival Best Director, which was amazingly surprising. But it was really an experiment for me to learn to move from the small videos into a full-scale, fully historical and period film with professional actors and try to recreate Iran in the 50s in Morocco. The next very ambitious project was a film about an incredible, iconic Egyptian singer, Kulthum, who some of you might know. She is by far the most important artist of the 20th century in the Middle East. If all of the people in the Middle East are fighting about different politics and religious issues, the one thing they all agree about is Kulthum, whether it's in Israel or in Egypt or Palestine or Syria or Iran. And this is something that I became very obsessed about, where a woman becomes this unifying power, an artist that becomes the soul of a nation, the soul of a region, and how art and music could be so powerful. And in fact, in a very male-dominated society, Kulthum became that icon, that hero, that myth. And in fact, the film became about a story of an Iranian woman attempting to make a film about an iconic Egyptian star and her inability to do that. And here again, a woman played me. And it really was about the failure of being able to go under the skin of a mythical artist such as Kulthum. Her music is known to have thrown people into the state of ecstasy, and to the point where people forgot the time and the day. Her concerts sometimes took 8 hours, and to this day, every taxi driver in Cairo is playing her music. I just found this, even though I don't speak Arabic, for me it was a great challenge to be able to direct a film that was in Arabic language to a film that was never made before about her, and to be able also to delve into Egyptian history, as it also grappled with traditional, conservative, and history in ancient time with Nasser period in modern time. So we recreated Cairo in Casablanca, just like we had with Women Without Men. Finally, Woman Without Woman, a lot of women. Land of Dreams was the only project that has simultaneously collapsed into photography, video, and a movie. And in this film, after we shot the photographs and the videos, I returned to New Mexico, and the same woman who played in the video, Sheila Vand, played in the movie. But this time we had Matt Dillon, we had Isabella Rossellini, Anna Gunn, we had major American stars. But again, it was the story of this woman collecting dreams. But this time she was collecting dreams for the Census Bureau and not for herself. And it's a 2-hour movie. All of these films can be seen in Amazon, and it was released in 2019. And what I wanted to mention is that one of my interests in making movies that it's not a commodity and it's not shown in galleries and museums, but actually are shown to general audience, to people who don't follow art per se. And that for me has been a very interesting challenge to write scripts, to work with script writers. In this case was working with Jean-Claude Carrier, which is a beloved, legendary scriptwriter in France that worked with Louis Bonoir, to really challenge myself as an artist to be able to tap into the popular culture. And these films, of course, don't have huge distributions, but they do show around the world, in cinemas, in festivals. And for me, this has been something that I'm pursuing simultaneously today as I do video, as I do photographs. And recently, I'm even directing opera. So it's been very, very interesting for me every single day, navigating in my practice, moving from thinking about a studio photography to movie, to opera, to video. And this has been a great lesson. But at the same time, I think the visual properties of all of my work are that of a visual artist. And I think that's my last image. Sorry, I think this is where I stop.
Thank you so much, Shirin. We have some time for questions. We can go till about 5:30. So I will keep track of hands raised, and a microphone will come to you if you have a question. Would anyone like to get us started? There's a question.
Okay, thank you so much for your incredible presentation. I studied your work in AP Art History when I was in high school, and I'm seriously fangirling really hard right now, so thank you so much. My question for you is, for Sarah, you talked about the different landscapes that women and men occupy. How were you, what was the process of choosing like the foresty landscape and then the water landscape that you showed in stills from that video?
Yeah, I think that every one of these projects, there's so many ideas at play. It's so difficult to speak in such a summarized way about every single one of this body of work deserves at least a half an hour for me to properly get into. But what you mentioned, for example, in the trilogy of Turbulent, Rapture, and Fervor, I had in mind that it really focused on the idea of masculine and feminine. But in the trilogy of Roja, Sarah, and Illusion and Mirror, which Natalie Portman played in it, it was the idea that each one took you to a different dream, and each one dealt with a different type of landscape. So Roja was about the built landscape and the desert landscape. Sarah was about the forest, and when she levitates in the water. And eventually Illusion and Mirror was by the ocean. So for me, the landscape has always been really the spiritual part of my work in a way. And I thought that it was really interesting for me to be able to tell the story of each dream, each character, each narrative in a different landscape, you know. So if you see them back to back, somehow they fall into the connection. There is a poetic connection between these three women in black, one in the desert, one in the forest, one in the sea, and then they connect together. So it took me like a couple of years to make those 3 videos, but there was a lot of thought and planning going on for that.
And if so, can't hear me? Have you been back to Iran, and if so, what has that been like? Has your family remained?
No, I can't go back to Iran. Without getting too much into details, the government of Iran has problem with my work, and even though I don't think my work is insulting or disrespecting anything, in fact, I only raise questions. I never criticize anybody. I never even think that I'm capable of criticizing anyone. I only frame questions. But nevertheless, the last time I was there, I barely got out. So I had a very difficult time that time, which was pretty terrifying. And so I think it's not even just for me, for a lot of Iranian people, you know, you haven't really have to do much to be in trouble with this government. But also sometimes it's not even the artwork, is what you say in the media, you know, and I have been present in the protest, or I've said things in the media that is definitely problematic, but my family remain in Iran.
You talked about how your generation was a generation that like participated in the '79 revolution, and that it was you were in the States, I believe, at that time. And
That's right.
how do you think like that was crucial that you weren't in Iran at this time? Do you think you could have seen yourself in those protests?
I mean, actually, I often think that my father sent us abroad in purpose because he may have predicted what was to come. Because I'm talking about a period where Khomeini at the time was alive in Iraq. And I remember my classmates after school would go and secretly listen to his speeches broadcasted from Iraq. And we were reading certain books that really were, most Iranian people know those books that many people consider that's what brought the revolution, and the Shah had banned. So we secretly, sometimes some of them were novels, but it was this whole move against westernization and Islamization of the country. And so I think that in my case, I was the only one in the family who was also slightly religious. I prayed every day. And I feel that had I stayed, and in fact, two of my best classmates became Mujahid, which is really another very terrible militant group, and they went to Iraq, and one of them got killed. And eventually I saw her in one of them, the sister who stayed alive in Sweden. So you understood that they have been going through, incredible hardship. Many of them were executed. Anyone who was Mujahid, systematically executed. So immediately after the revolution in 1979, the government began, Khomeini, all the students who helped him to bring the revolution, he started to assassinate all of them, execute them. And so many fled, and many young people got murdered, executed. And so even my current husband was a political activist, and he was very active. So yes, I think that this is perhaps why my father wished to send his children abroad. Not openly, but I think he did.
Thank you for visiting us here at Brown. My question to you is, it has to do with language. Your talk really made me think of a quote by Eva Hoffman, her book Lost in Translation. Her and her family had to leave Poland because of the war. And one of the examples she gave in her memoir was when the person she was dating at the time asked her to marry her, and she said yes in English, but in her native language, she said no. And I'm just curious, has that happened to you in your work, where in your native language, you see it, view it in a certain way, but when you express it in English, it's a bit different?
I've gone through many chapters in my life. At the beginning, literally, when I arrived and the doors closed behind me in Iran, I didn't have even remote family. So I was in school surrounded only with American. And then came to New York. I knew a few people, but it has been for the past, since I became an artist, and I met my current partner, and I'm working mainly with Iranian people. So it was a return, and also I went back to Iran. So there was a big part of my early period in America where I was completely isolated and alone, but also not so connected to the American culture either. But then at some point when I made art, it was almost like the need to reconnect with the Iranian culture. Today, I'm almost constantly with Iranian people. I work mainly with Iranian people, and my husband cooks Persian food every day. And we speak both Farsi and English, but he's my generation, and he also is a filmmaker. And I notice sometimes both when I'm thinking and when I'm talking, I'm going in and out of English and Farsi. But before that, before I really became active as an artist again, I was married to a Korean. My son is half Korean and Iranian. I was always taught speaking in English, But now this Iranian side of me is far more awakened. But I think if you take me to Iran today, I would definitely feel like an outsider, without a doubt. I work with people who, some of them go back and forth to Iran, but many of them, like me, live in exile. So there's that connection between us that is not just an artistic collaboration, but a way to create a kind of a community where we feel at home, but also we're growing together as we're making work. And all of the video that you have seen, all the films, all the photographs are created with the same community of people. So I feel like, of course, I am their leader, if you could call it that, but I've created a community, and many of them are also artists. And so it is my little Iran, you know. And it's a very good question. That's been fundamental to my work. And politically, we are very, very, very involved with what goes on in Middle East, goes on in Iran. I'm hooked to Al Jazeera, to all the news about Israel, Palestine, Iran. There's no day that goes without us following what's going on. And my elderly mother is on the last stage of her life. Unfortunately, she's passing probably very soon. So I call her every day at 8 in the morning to Iran, FaceTime or WhatsApp, to see her. And that's about, the last thing I want to say, now that I feel more relaxed, is that for the longest time I felt that even though I have family in Iran, this unconditional love of a mother, it's so critical. And my mother and I have spoken every day at 8 o'clock for years and years. And I always worried about the loss of a mother would be such a big price for me, because it's not just the loss of the mother, it's the loss of motherland, you know, because I think none of my siblings would be as caring as speaking to me as often. And so it would be my last connection in many ways. And that I consider a profound loss when she passes. And I'm anticipating that. And that's something for me, it's very hard to talk about, because much of what's like to live in a forced exile is, and I was telling to someone the other day, you forced yourself not to remember, because it's so profoundly painful to think about the past, the impossibility of a unity. It's impossible for me to see my mother, impossible for me to. So the fact that we have gotten so used to the impossibility of a reunion is profoundly painful. But what do? We don't think about it. We just live the present life. And I think the sense of displacement for people, it's not just about me, but for a lot of immigrants, for a lot of people who living in apartheid, for a lot of people who living in an oppressive situation where they don't have a choice, psychologically, politically, emotionally. They're vulnerable. And that never escapes you, but you learn to live with that pain day after day. And I'm lucky, I'm an artist, because I have a way to channel that pain. But I have no idea how other people do it, you know? And no wonder I make so many crazy work about madness, about insanity, about nightmares, you know? It's all of my nightmares, right? But it's a long way of answering your question. But I just feel like this is a better way to talk about art than showing slides, because you could never really talk about all this work in such a quick way. But you can only touch on where the ideas are rooted.
Hi, I've been looking at your work for years, and I've always been mesmerized and moved by it. But I have to say, I've also been guilty of the reductionism, that you know, a limited amount of touch points to kind of understand it from. And I wondered if you had ever thought of writing artist statements to accompany your work to help guide the viewer who struggles to understand your perspective and what you're trying to say. I'm thrilled to be here because I've been trying to understand you for years.
Well, I'm not.
So-
I'm not good with words. I think that actually, I think it's also a mistake sometimes to describe your work, to try to define it, because art should be experienced in a very guttural way. You either get it or you don't. And if you have to explain it to convince people what it is, then it's not really working, is it? So I always think that art is something an artist is a servant of, and it just sort of grows on you, and you just respond to it, you know? And it's like what Wendy said, it's coming from the inner and outer world of an artist. And I think that it communicates differently to people from different cultures. Like, for example, how my work may resonate to you, it would be very different to an Iranian or a Muslim or a Jew or people from different countries. I've learned that as I traveled with my work, that different cultures respond totally differently. And I can't make that translation easy. I think it's better not to talk about it. So either you relate to the work or you don't. If I can take an opportunity, one tiny thing that I forgot, there's something else I wanted to touch on that I didn't talk about, this, to distinguish between art and activism. Because ultimately, my work comes so close to politically charged issues that very often people ask me, well, what do you think? What is your opinion? What is your point of view? And I always say, in political activism, you make a distinction between good and evil, what is right and wrong. But in art, you don't do that. You don't decide for your audience what is good and evil. You let the audience to have their own interpretation, right? And then, because otherwise it's not art, it's a propaganda. So it kind of relates to what you're asking, that if I have to go and describe, translate, and define my work, then it's not art, is it? Because you don't ask that from a painting or a painter or, a musician, and so that's the issue. Sure.
I'd like to thank you so much for coming. First of all, merci. And then you obviously talked about women, and the talk is called Women in Art in Times of Political Crisis. And I was wondering what you make of the woman-led movement a couple years ago, Women, Life, Freedom in Iran, and also where you think we're headed.
I'm really glad you brought that up there, because it ties into women and time of political crisis. I mean, always in my work, whether in photography, video, and film, I've emphasized the rebellious, the resilience, the defiance of Iranian women who have been major inspiration for me, some of whom I've used their text, poems, and their novels in my work. Every time I've had shortcomings or felt like a failure, I look to Iranian women as inspiration. Because the more they're against the wall, the more confrontational and resilient they are. So I was not surprised that when Mahsa Amini died, that unleashed the rage of Iranian women. And that led to something that we made believe that could be the first female-led revolution in the history. And of course, I was not also surprised that the government of Iran counteracted through violence and atrocity, tried to repress. But this movement is the most beautiful, the most euphoric upheaval we have had, most important since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. And I think it was the closest we came as an Iranian community living inside and outside to have a sense of union, to have, regardless of our economic, religious, class differences, to feel that we agree on one thing, that this government has to be removed. You need democracy. And unfortunately, it was cut loose, but what it's beautiful is that the fire is going. I think, as you can see in Iran today, from what I hear, the women continue to control the scene by refusing to wear the veil. And in fact, I heard the day Iran attacked Israel was the same day that they went back to, just 3 days ago, their harsh rules on women must wear the veil again, meaning that they're afraid of a few things. One of them is women, aside from Israel. So it's incredible how threatening women are to the order of this regime.
I wanted to thank you so very much for coming, and you make me so proud to be Persian.
Oh, thank you.
And I did in 1964.
Oh, thank you. I feel like tonight was a bit like a performance. I was, it's good because I feel that it's very interesting to face an audience that you have no idea. Sometimes I speak at art schools or, and you're dealing with art students that you can really talk about the form or the idea of the artistic practice. Tonight we have a very diverse audience, and I think it's really important for us to understand that artists are also very vulnerable and very fragile, but that does not mean that they're less than strong. And I going back to the theme of this event, I think that artists are absolutely, especially women artists, absolutely necessary in time of political crisis. And thank you for inviting me, and I hope I didn't disappoint you too much.